Hey guys, me and Buster Green here, and I guess I'm reviewing Urusei Yatsura again because specifically we need to talk about Ryunosuke and Nagisa. Nagisa is driving the internet wild, and I guess the internet was just not prepared for Nagisa in 2024 like they were in 1988. And so that's a fun topic that I feel like there's a lot to depack here on. Now, first things first, before I even get into all that, let's just do a quick catch up on the reboot anime because I haven't been covering this anime very closely, but I have been watching it. So, Urusei Yatsura was a classic anime from the 80s and it was rebooted in 2022. In 2022, season 1, overall, I would say it's not been the most amusing reboot ever. Now, it's been going on for another 2 years past that, and season 1 just didn't quite roll out the episodes in exactly the same order as the manga or even the original 80s anime. Instead, it kind of seemed to be doing its very own interesting thing. And what it seemed to be doing was a speed run to the status quo that the 1980s Urusei Yatsura left off on, which is kind of wild. So originally, Urusei Yatsura starts off as pretty much a show entirely focused on the singular love triangle between Shinobu, Ataru, and Lum. But slowly as the show goes on, one by one, new supporting cast members are introduced until eventually you get literally dozens of crazy episodes, dozens of crazy characters, and the show has a sprawling cast like The Simpsons, and every time a new cast member is introduced, they spend a couple of episodes explaining how this new cast member will warp the show's existing dynamic. It's fun. Now, one thing I don't love about the 80s version very early introduces Ten, and Ten immediately throws off the show's balance by just being an annoying magical baby character. The reboot, meanwhile, has done its own weirdness. The biggest differences I can say about the reboot are they introduced Mendo extremely early instead of Ten. They basically introduced Mendo where Ten would have come in, and then they also reintroduced Ryunosuke absurdly early. Ryunosuke Fujinami is basically the last major character introduced in Urusei Yatsura, and she comes in around chapter 147 of the original manga, which is about episode 63 of the 80s anime. So getting her in the first 20 episodes of the reboot, I was not prepared for that, and it definitely shows kind of the weird and wild trajectory that the reboot is traveling on. As best as I can say, they weren't trying to develop the world slowly or carefully like the original show did. They were more or less trying to throw everything out all at once, see what stuck, explain the bare minimum as fast as possible, and it was very much like what the DC Extended Universe did, going from a Superman movie to a Justice League movie in the course of 3 movies. Now, Urusei Yatsura Season 2 has been even more of a mindfuck because if Season 1 was just a speed run to get to the end of the show's status quo, Season 2 is kind of accelerating that process even more by throwing out these really obscure D-list characters from the real end of the show, characters from the real outer rim of the Urusei Yatsura extended universe. Like, instead of episodes building up Lum's family and her inner circle, her friends like Ran and Yuki, we've instead got episodes throwing out some really out there characters like Inaba, the space-time rabbit, a pretty one-shot, one-story character. And what drove me nuts this season was we got a ton of episodes focused on Asuka Mizunokoji, who, to put Asuka Mizunokoji into perspective, Ataru is the main character of the show. Mendo is Ataru's rich romantic rival. Mendo has an estranged childhood friend named Tobimaru, who is a samurai. Tobimaru has a younger sister named Asuka. Asuka is mentally scarred due to her isolated abnormal upbringing, her crazy parents, and has a deadly fear of all men, coupled with the fact that she barely understands what a man is. So yes, in 2 seasons, we've had multiple episodes focused on a character that is at least 4 levels of direct relationship away from the main character. And where I was okay with this character in the 80s because they took their time to get there, Mendo was introduced, Tobimaru was introduced, and I don't think Asuka even came up until like 100 episodes in when those characters got kind of boring. In the 2020s version, it really felt like they rushed to her out of nowhere and gave her way too much focus because they barely even established Mendo in the show. And I feel like they've only showed Tobimaru like once in the show, so the whole thing was a real head scratcher. Now, all I can really composite based on this is that what they're doing with the reboot is they're playing out the episodes in a way that Season 1 of Urusei Yatsura was mostly set up to introduce new viewers to the old characters as fast as possible. And in season 2, now that they feel like they're almost at that status quo, they're just proceeding forward like season 2 is actually season 5 of the 80s show. Do you get that? Here's a flowchart. Now, next up, I mostly want to talk today about Ryunosuke and Ryunosuke's character arc on the show and what Ryunosuke meant back in the 80s. So Ryunosuke Fujiwara is a character that Rumiko pretty much invented as an exploration of gender studies, and Ryu-chan ends up being a really fucked up character both inside and out for how she's grown up and the way she's been treated by her family, society, and the people she goes to school with. Now, if you haven't seen the show, in short form, Ryunosuke comes from this poor, trash Japanese family. Her dad is a fisherman, and because they were so poor, because he's a fisherman, her mom died when she was a baby, and her dad really wanted a son, but since her mom died, her dad just raised her entire life to be a boy. Now, because of the whole patriarchy thing, because of the way Japan still is, and because her dad is a cheapskate and men's stuff is cheaper than girls' stuff, Ryunosuke has basically been brainwashed into thinking she's a boy. Now, I think in the 80s series, they go a lot deeper into it. But long story short, Ryunosuke fully thought she was a boy until she reached puberty, and then realizing that she's not a boy, she just gets very confused and conflicted about everything. Because Ryunosuke is initially presented as this tough, violent boy who loves to fight, but then as she's like dealing with her gender dysphoria, Ryunosuke becomes a sort of early 80s trans icon, because although she is a cisgender female, because she was raised as a man, because she has a male lifestyle, she's put in this weird position where she deep down has these repressed feelings of gender dysphoria for her own natural female gender. She constantly fantasizes about what sort of woman she could be if she embraced her nature as a woman, and although she makes minor attempts to feminize herself and to try and meet other girls, over the course of the series, her male upbringing, her awkwardness around other girls, and her dad reinforcing that she is a man and always will be, keeps her in this fucked up mental state. And it's played for comedy, and it becomes almost a little bit funny when Ataru and Mendo try to further pressure her into being a girl in the most revolting ways possible so that they can date her, and that just fills her with utter disgust at what the idea of a woman even is, questioning to herself why she would ever want to be one in the first place. And that's pretty much it for that character and as far as her arc goes. For the rest of the show, that's pretty much it. But back in the 80s, Ryunosuke was a huge hit character. I would say she's pretty much the biggest breakout character in the show because there had just never been a sort of bold genderqueer character like that at that time, especially not in a funny show like Urusei Yatsura. And so there was this big debate at the time, and people were kind of begging Rumiko to make Ryunosuke have her own spin-off show, like Jeffersons or All in the Family. Now, there's officially no material about what a Ryunosuke spin-off show would have eventually been, but the theory goes that Rumiko thought about it and eventually retooled the idea into Ranma 1/2, Rumiko's next comedy adventure epic, which was also deeply about an exploration of gender and gender norms, and the rest is history. But Ranma and Ryunosuke are extremely different characters when compared to each other side by side. Ranma is a heterosexual man trapped in a woman's body, and Ryunosuke is a maybe heterosexual woman trapped in a man's gender construct. Whereas Ranma is pretty clearly into Akane, Ryunosuke's gender confusion makes it very unclear if she does want to date men, or if she wants to prove she's a woman, or if she wants to date girls to reinforce that idea that she is actually a man. And pretty hilariously, girls actually want to date her back because they either think she's safer than a man, or she is a man, and maybe even if they know she isn't, they just think she's cute. Now, the next and really only big development that ever happens in Ryunosuke's arc is the ending, and that's what I want to talk about today, the ending of Ryunosuke's arc. So, Urusei Yatsura is fundamentally a romantic comedy, and it's about coming to terms with the people who love you and loving them back. And it's pretty obvious for most of the original anime that ultimately Lum and Ataru will get past their blatant hostility and settle for each other, and the same can probably be said about Shinobu and Mendo. Ryunosuke, however, was the odd one out because Ryunosuke technically had no romantic prospects at all, and seemingly just existed on the show to give and take abuse from Ataru and Mendo. However, this status quo eventually changes, and Ryunosuke's ending for me is the original manga's chapter 341, Nagisa's Fiancé, one of the last 20 chapters of the manga's original run. Or, And alternatively, in the anime, this is Urusei Yatsura OVA episode number 5, released December 8th, 1988, literally 5 months before the first episode of Ranma 1/2 would air in Japan. However, season 2, episode 16, aka episode 39 of the 2022 anime, is also the exact same story. And in my opinion, this episode has zero difference between the OVA and the remake, so whatever version you're watching, you're going to get the same story, you're going to get the same product. So I feel confident that I can kind of talk about both versions right now without there being any contradictions, because they're both the exact same story through and through. Now, this episode, in my opinion, is the perfect end to Ryunosuke's gender-bent arc. It introduces Nagisa, a character literally made to be with Ryunosuke. The fucked up backstory behind her is that Ryunosuke's father apparently had a best friend named Shiwatari, and shortly after Shiwatari gave birth to Nagisa, Shiwatari and Ryunosuke's father made a deal, they made a vow that both Ryunosuke and Nagisa would eventually be engaged to be married. And then the additional fucked up level here is that because Ryunosuke's father had already started raising Ryunosuke to be a boy at the time, Shiwatari then decided to raise Nagisa as a girl. So once again, Ryunosuke is a woman raised to be a man, and Nagisa now is a man raised to be a woman. And the two of them were engaged as babies to be the perfect gender reverse couple. Literally, these two redneck idiots raised their kids in this bizarre-ass sociological experiment where they reversed the gender norms like they were goddamn Nazis or whatever. But here we are, and that's kind of what happened with these two characters. These two characters were basically created for each other. Now, anyway, Nagisa and her dad are also suddenly revealed to be dead. They died of starvation immediately after they're introduced. However, somehow a miracle happens and only Nagisa comes back to life. And so what happens is Ryunosuke is weirded out that she's engaged to another girl, but then it turns out through the course of them talking that Ryunosuke eventually discovers that Nagisa is actually a boy. And so she immediately rejects him, but too bad they're now unofficially married. So this is Ryunosuke 1980's official ending. Ryunosuke's ending wasn't that she ended up with Ataru, it was that she literally became Ataru. Ataru, who has always been stuck in a permanent one-sided abusive marriage with Lum. That's Ryunosuke's life now. She has become him, and she is now stuck in her own permanent one-sided abusive marriage with Nagisa. And arguably, this is an even worse version than the one between Ataru and Lum, because she still also has her abusive, parasitic, manipulative dad to take care of. And you know what? For me, that was honestly the perfect ending to the character. Like, a lot of these characters are fucked up, and this is kind of a fucked up ending, but I love this ending. For all the shit she's always given to Ataru, now she literally is in the same situation as him. And I think that's just kind of poetic irony. Like, plus just like theoretically how Ataru and Lum can theoretically be a perfect couple if they can just get past each other's bullshit and embrace each other. I kind of feel like that same trope also applies to Nagisa and Ryunosuke. They are literally creepily made for each other, and I don't think anyone else in the world could work out for them romantically because of the bizarre and disturbing way they've both been raised. And as I sit here dwelling on it, I kind of wonder that if Rumiko had actually made the Ryunosuke show instead of Ranma, would this have been the first episode of it? Because this is pretty much a repeat of the core first episode of Urusei Yatsura all over again, except now the main character is Ryunosuke, not Ataru. And it's a real mindfuck when you think about it, that we could have had another 300 episode show about Ryunosuke and Nagisa's unintended engagement, but anyway, that was all fine and good because I'm pretty sure no one except me ever managed to read up past manga chapter 341. But yeah, so back to the remix. So now we are actually finally getting some stories about what happens after that. And in this new Ryunosuke-centered timeline, we move on to Season 2, Episode 17, continuing the status quo of Nagisa and Ryunosuke now living together. And once again, confusing the timeline because the remake is just kind of throwing out stories at random. Ryunosuke is shown wearing girls' panties in this episode, which was a major character development plot point in the old show, that her dad had forbidden her from doing that and forced her to wear boxer shorts her entire life. And then hilariously, she was unable to buy panties because stores would misgender her as a perverted boy. And that was something that she needed to figure out how to deal with and get past. But anyway, if you haven't realized, Ryunosuke pretty much exists to showcase the fucked up double standards of gender in Japan. and in a way shine light on how fucked they are by exploring all this through this strange backward gendered character. Now, you can pretty much say that Nagisa exists in exactly the same way, but holy shit, the double standards and the online outrage at Nagisa, good lord, like, just goes to show ya, thank God there was no Twitter in 1988, because the weird reaction to Nagisa online has just been absolutely wild to me. Like, literally the double standards that she's meant to expose in satire. Holy shit, you guys. Twitter is just straight up exposing. Like, a simple search for, like, Nagisa on Twitter. Like, people think it's hilarious when an abused woman is living like a man, but an abused man living like a woman? That is just too woke, bro. Like, there's also this extra level of weirdness that Ryunosuke and Nagisa pretty much share the same abusive love that Lum and Ataru have. But then the weird double standard here is that Lum abuses Ataru all the time, and that's played off for comedy. So now here we have Ryunosuke abusing Nagisa. But in my head, I'm registering Nagisa as a female, and seeing a female being abused by her boyfriend, that just fundamentally feels icky to me. So even like myself, my own conceptions of gender are being challenged by this character, and that for me is kind of thrilling. Now, also, Ryunosuke's passive sexuality mixed with Nagisa's more typically masculine, aggressive sexuality is throwing everybody off, because nowadays people want to cancel all sexually aggressive men while giving sexually aggressive women a pass. But then for the most part, here we have Nagisa, and Nagisa is throwing everybody off, because if you assume she's a man, then you have to assume she's sexually aggressive. But then you're misgendering her, or what is that bullshit? And then if you give her a pass because she's a woman, then are you saying that women are allowed to be sexually aggressive nowadays? Isn't that fucked up too? So there's like no winning with this character. Anyway, episode 17 is a great episode. It has some really interesting character development between the two of them. Ryunosuke is straight up abusive towards Nagisa and wants to beat her out of her house. And on the flip side, Nagisa is a little probably overly too sexually aggressive due to her male sex drive. But then Sakura shows up and puts like a ghost talisman on her hair, and it seems like it's gonna like kill her. And then she seemingly almost dies. And then when she seemingly almost dies, Ryunosuke changes his mind that he actually did care about her. But it's an immediate comedy fake out and she comes back. And then Lum and Ataru show up randomly. Ataru continues abusing Nagisa. And then Ryunosuke and Nagisa have a big fight. And Nagisa does not want to fight Ryunosuke, so she just plays it entirely defensive the entire fight. Eventually, Nagisa overpowers Ryunosuke. And surprisingly, for the first time in the entire show, Ryunosuke actually shows some form of an attraction to Nagisa. And then she cries after the fact. But Nagisa also pretty much leaves emotionally devastated, saying that she could never hurt someone she loved. And this whole like fight actually makes Ryunosuke finally confirm her engagement to Nagisa and accept that now they live together as a married couple. And wow, that was really intense, but I'm really shocked and happy that they actually made it work in the end. So once again, I'm so baffled that they threw out this character so early in the show. Maybe them doing this means that they're not expecting the show to get renewed to season 3, and maybe they just wanted to finish off Nagisa and Ryu's story, that it was destiny, and like close it up more carefully than they did in the 80s. But if they're not confident they're getting a season 3, then why did they waste so many episodes doing Asuka and Rabbit Guy stories? Maybe Nagisa's just going to be on the show now. Who knows? Oh, and by the way, I guess while I'm discussing it, also at the end of episode 17 was the Jari-10 episode, which kind of doesn't make sense without the previous story explaining why 10 went insane in the first place. But then there was this hilarious discussion online that the episode was going to be turned down and that they censored Yari-10's grenades into pine cones. Except in the actual episode, he has the pine cones and then he has the grenades. So total fake out, huh? Take that, you whiners. You got tricked by the next episode preview. All right, so yeah, that's basically where we're at with season 2 of Urusei Yatsura right now. They're throwing out some real endgame characters really early into the show, and no one's really quite sure what to make of it. But let me know if you're watching the show and what you guys think. And for God's sake, tell me what you think of the Ryunosuke-Nagisa relationship, because that's a very amusing relationship. Ha 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 ha. I am going to fade away now. Bye.